what is the role of the arts in the area of generative AI, and what's the role of the human? The word arts and sciences in this context are fungible. So you could ask the same question about the sciences. In this particular episode, I want to talk about art. I'm writing a larger essay which will hopefully cover the role of the arts and the sciences in the new area of generative AI. In a nutshell, the way I see the arts evolving is that the process of an artistic endeavor initiated by a human is going to be to feed the machine. So the way we feed the machine, which is the AI, that is going to be the process of art. I want to go back a little bit in art history, back to the area of modern art, and explain why I think there is a very tight relationship between the evolution of modern art around the turn of the 20th century in Paris with the avant-garde and Picasso and Matisse in particular, and the relationship between them and the evolution of physics and the birth of theoretical physics as a field, and the concept of seeing art through theory, which has a parallel in the sciences, which is you see the science through theory, which is the birth of theoretical physics. Now, that's not to say that this didn't exist before. Of course, we had theory all the time. Theory is the fundamental concept by which humans further their knowledge in any kind of context, even way back in the Stone Age, right? Whether it was a sorcerer who came up with some sort of theory or whether it was Einstein, the concept is the same. But I would say that the forces and the cultural acceptance of theory as a means to see, that was the fundamental idea of the modern art movement, and in parallel in science in the turn of the 20th century. So now we are in the first third of the 21st century, and we are witnessing a massive paradigm shift, which is driven by what we call generative AI. I want to discuss this. I want to elaborate what the fundamental forces are of generative AI and what the role of the human is in the process of creating art in the area of generative AI. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's March 26, 2024. This is Krim Telco. For the day, the fund is up 1.3%. The market's down 40 basis points. For the year, we are down 15.4%. The market's up 9.1%. We're underperforming by 24.5%. So let me lay the groundwork for this episode. I want to talk about the role of art in the context of the area of generative AI in which we are right now. So this is a very contemporary episode. In order to get to my conclusion, which is that the role of the human in the process of generative AI is going to be to feed the beast, to feed the machine, to feed the AI. So the artistic process, the artist, the creation of art will consist in training the AI, in feeding it the data, in developing models. So the artist is going to be very technical, and this has parallels to every art epoch. I'm going to compare it to the area of modern art, which is an area that I've been studying recently. In particular, now I'm reading, The Painting That Shocked the World, which describes sort of the evolution of modern art through the eyes of Picasso and Matisse in particular around the turn of the 20th century. My thesis is that there's always a relationship between science and technology and the arts. In particular, science, technology a bit less, but science and arts are, in a nutshell, they're like two parallel lanes, which are driven by the same force, right? That's also why in the university we call it arts and sciences. It is really the same thing. It just has a different perspective. The arts are visual, decorative. Science is, in a sense, more maybe driven by, okay, what can we actually do with it? Although pure scientists would say, no, it doesn't really matter whether we apply it or not. Science for the sake of science is as important as art for the sake of art. And if you look at also the status, in particular in societies that value arts very highly, those societies also value the scientists very highly. I'm thinking of Italy or maybe Spain or places like that, where we have a huge tradition of artists, famous artists, and these types of societies also have a very, very high esteem of the culture of science, versus we have maybe societies like the Dutch, to some extent China, Switzerland, Germany, where the technology, the application of the arts and sciences has more legs. Germany, for example, created Bauhaus, which was an applied, if you will, if it's an applied, artistic endeavor. And of course, Germany has a huge culture in engineering and technology. Silicon Valley, if you look at Silicon Valley, there's if in a nutshell, I mean, you could say that there's definitely not a lot of appreciation for art, other than decorative and status driven, but there isn't really an avant-garde of edgy, artistically minded people living in Silicon Valley, nor is there a community of edgy, artistically driven, scientifically minded people. It's more like, how can we use this? How can we make money? Now, of course, the lines blur. If you look at OpenAI and maybe Ilya Sutskever, who, according to Chris Reed, deserves the Field Medal in Math, some of the work that has been done at OpenAI certainly deserves the badge of artistic, creative, fundamental, but it's also technology and engineering. So the lines blur sometimes. So let me now outline, like I said, let me outline the process here. What I'm going to try to do is try to explain why I think that we are in a massive change as far as artistic endeavor is concerned, and that's driven by Gen AI. And the reason I believe that is that we always have a change in science, or in, if you will, in the way we see nature, in the way we see ourselves, in the way we see physics or nature. Maybe that's the better description. There's always a relationship between that and the way we actually perform art. I mean, that's maybe to some extent an oxymoron, because not an oxymoron, excuse me. It's a what's the word for something that's obvious? It doesn't matter. What I'm trying to say, maybe that's obvious for some people, but I think it's still worth mentioning that the way we see the world is often driven by scientific or paradigm shifts. It's this goes back to Thomas Kuhn. This goes back to Galileo. The point is, once we see the world in different terms, we also change the way we perform art, because seeing the world through art or science is the same thing. So, having said that, what I'm trying to say here is that we are seeing the world now in different terms. We are in a new area. We call it Gen AI. We might change that at some point, call it something else. Maybe it gets an artistic badge, and then that area will be called whatever, modern. Like the early part of the 20th century was called the modern area, and that was driven by the art world, even though actually it started, in my opinion, it started with science. So let me parse that first. So what do I mean with it started with science and then it became sort of an art movement? So we have the turn of the century, Max Planck, and the quantum discovery which is a scientific discovery, that is that energy is quantized. We have an evolution of quantum mechanics and finally a further evolution into quantum physics, which a professional physicist today would say it's just physics. There's no such thing as quantum physics. There just is physics, because physics and quantum physics are the same thing. There's just this other thing called Newtonian physics, which is just a little abbreviated version of the actual physics that we study today. And to be fair, we just didn't know better. What Newton and Co did was really great, but they just didn't know better, and now we know better, and whatever we study is quantum physics. But the important point for this episode is it's more the way we see the world. And the way we see the world in quantum physics is fundamentally through theory. And that's really, really important, because we don't have a good grasp, or our senses are not evolved to see or feel or hear what's going on at the quantum level, in the atom, between the electrons and the valence electrons, and all those things that have morphed into physics, quantum chemistry, and all these sciences. We require theory to understand what's going on at that level. Now that, again, might be an obvious thing. Yeah, duh, so what? Well, it's a little bit more subtle than that, because on the other hand, we also have relativity, which is, again, we're not evolved as humans to really have a good sense from the senses what's going on when things go at the speed of light. In fact, we can't even imagine what that means, to go at the speed of light. And that's because we humans just don't go at those types of speeds. In fact, we're not even close to that, right? So, however, we're able to harness the powers and the theories around that because we developed the theory. And this is one of the most important quotes from David Deutsch, who is just, call it, a descendant of a dynasty of quantum physics scholars. You know, he's in the footsteps of Everett and Wiener, and then it goes back to Einstein, of course, and Heisenberg. And what he says is that observations are theory laden. That's a really, really important statement. And it ties right into the evolution of modern art and the essay by Tom Wolfe, The Painted Word, which is it just depicts the New York art scene of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But it's really, really important because it actually ties right into this concept of observations are theory laden. Here's what I mean by that. It means that what we see is driven by the theories that we use to explain what we see. Whatever we see requires an explanation. And that explanation is driven by theory. And there's a reciprocity here. There's a flywheel of theory, observation, theory, observation. Now, this has been the case in the 20th century. And for people like me who are born in the second part of the 20th century, that's obvious. But for people before me, that wasn't obvious. We go back to the Enlightenment, actually, it was the exact opposite. People wanted to get away from the back then prevalent theory, which was scholastic, and they wanted to get away from that. And what they did is they chose observation as sort of the how should I say, the benchmark, the ground truth, because they knew instinctively that scholastic theory did not serve most purposes very well. But what I mean by that is you couldn't build technology based on scholastic theory. Like, for example, if you wanted to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and your explanation for weather forecasts came through the lens of, well, the angels are angry today, so that's why the weather's bad, that's not very useful. So you need a different type of ground truth. So what people started using is observation. They just said, look, whatever we see is what is. And from that, we had a whole movement of the Enlightenment starting, and the scientific method, and all kinds of things coming from there. Now, what's interesting is that we kind of go pretty extreme to some extent, and I'm not familiar with all the philosophers and scientists that have been, proponents of this versus that theory, but there's been maybe they were called positivists, I'm not quite sure, but there's definitely a movement of a scientific movement and an artistic movement. And this particular episode, by the way, is going to focus on the arts, okay? But still, so we have a scientific and artistic movement of realism, of what I see is what I know. What I can't see is irrelevant to me. And that changes around the 20th century. Again, it's not like Einstein and Picasso were the only people who had this idea that you could think and then produce science or art. Okay, Picasso was not the only artist to have a concept in mind and then see art through that concept. There's a scene in the book, The Painting That Shocked the World, a scene that I think encompasses this evolution of seeing art through theory. And the scene is Leo Stein, the art collector that famously collected Matisse and helped bootstrap the modern movement of the avant-garde in Paris simply by buying paintings of Matisse, and his sister Gertrude Stein, she bought Picasso. So both of them kind of helped bootstrap the modern art movement, because from there we had Cubism, and then all the other things followed, all the way to Jackson Pollock and Warhol and all that. All of these artists root in the modern movement of the avant-garde in Paris, because that's where it starts. The idea that we have the painted word, in the words of Tom Wolfe, which is we see art through theory. And there's a scene in the book where Leo Stein explains the art to the artist. And this is so powerful. So he explains the art to the artist. The artist is the illustrator of the true artist, who is the critic. That's the painted word, Tom Wolfe. This comes 50 years after this particular scene happened in Paris in the early 20th century. And very similarly, we have in science, theoretical physicists, that the birth of theoretical physics is really at around that time. Now, it was before, don't get me wrong. Scientists will go, well, what about Boltzmann? What about Maxwell? Yes, I know. There's been theories before and formulas created and all that, Galileo. But the cultural acceptance of theory as the driving force, the theorist, the theoretical physicist who explains to the experimentalist what he's actually doing, that is new. That's modern art, or the modernity, right? So where are we today? Eventually this episode hopefully will culminate into a conclusion that depicts what's going on today. Today we have a new paradigm shift. Now the paradigm today is generative AI. What is generative AI? It is the ability to build machines that can find patterns in raw data and then inference from those patterns that they found and solve problems that are rooted in that data that they were trained, but not necessarily are linear extrapolations of that, but they can find new inferences, new pathways, new relationships between raw data, and therefore create something new, something that humans might have thought of or might not have thought of. There's two examples I want to use to illustrate what I mean with coming up with new ideas or new. Let's not use those words. Let's just say we have some raw data. So we have raw data, AlphaGo Zero is a machine that was developed by DeepMind, now Google. The company was bought by Google. And it was in the sort of 2010, 11, 12 time frame. Not, I think the paper actually came out in 13, so it must have been happening before that. So what did they do? So they looked at raw data, and the raw data in this case is people playing Go. That's the raw data. So people playing Go. In fact, they didn't even do that. What they did is they created a simulator that self-plays Go. So they had to define the game of Go in some ways. They didn't do a lot, though. They let the machine figure it out itself. And what they did is they created what's called a reinforcement learning model. And what they also did is they found a way to update the policy that the agent is using based on that reinforcement learning model. They found a way to update that on the fly. So they kind of did the following. They said, look, you're going to start playing this game. I'm not going to tell you anything about it. You don't know the rules. You don't know anything. I'm just going to give you rewards when you do something good, and I'm going to punish you when you do something bad. Now, I know I'm the programmer, the person that works for DeepMind, actually human. I know what's good and bad in terms of, I know the rules, and I can tell you eventually whether you won or not. But that's all about it, more or less. So now the art or the problem or the scientific challenge is to develop a model, an abstract model, a mathematical representation of this particular situation, which again is, if you do something right, I'm going to reward you. If you do something not so good, I'm going to punish you. That in itself is an incredibly difficult and problem that requires a lot of creativity. And I'm going there with a purpose, okay? Maybe let me give you the punchline already so you're not waiting for Godot here, meaning you're not waiting and waiting. So what's the point, right? The punchline is that the artist of today, or let's say the modern, no, I'm not going to use the word, the contemporary artist is going to be the person that is developing the machine along the lines of what the people at DeepMind did with AlphaGo Zero. So the development of the machine is the creation of the art. What kind of model am I going to use? How creative can I be around that model? There is something called reward function design, which means that problem set, which is, if you do something right, I'm going to reward you. If you do something not so good, I'm going to punish you. That's called a reward function design. Well, what does it mean to be right? What does it mean not to be right? All of these questions, that is the artistic process. So the artist of today is going to think about how to design an AI to then create the art. Designing the AI encompasses not just building a model, it also encompasses what data to feed that AI. So for example, should the AI just be trained in simulation, or should the AI have some real-world experience too? That is, again, part of the artistic process. In other words, the AI pipeline, the pipeline that engineers would call machine learning pipeline or MLOps or whatever, these kinds of words are being thrown around Silicon Valley, that actually in itself, that is the artistic process. Now, I want to just put a caveat here. I don't think that people who are working on the self-driving problem at Tesla, I wouldn't call them artists, and that's not to demean them. It's more like they don't have the kind of freedom that an artist has. And this will be one of the things that, if you ask me what is not changing, so what is changing and what is not changing? Well, clearly something's changing. We see the world differently today than we saw it 100 years ago during the time of the modernity of the avant-garde in Paris. Right? We see the world differently. Art during the avant-garde in Paris was that the artist uses the art of painting or sculpturing. Let's just stick with painting. So Picasso when he painted the portrait of Gertrude Stein, he used the lines, so the contours of the painting itself, the contours themselves became part of the art. Versus in the realism, in the world before Picasso, things like lines were just there to express something. They were meant to express hair, mountains, sunlight, that kind of thing. Versus in the art of Picasso, the lines themselves, the contours, the objects became part of the artistic process. Hence, it was required also, theory was required to interpret that piece of art. The culmination of that, of course, is abstract art, where those objects just themselves are the artistic process, and they don't represent anything anymore in terms of realistic representation. So when we see the world differently, that's when we also change the art, and art changes when the world is seen differently. The world is seen differently because the art changes. So these are all reciprocal processes, and it's hard to pin down what comes first. But it's certainly, it's probably a good bet to think that it's usually the science which goes first. It's not proven, but it's probably the case. And by the way, it's not a coincidence that in the Renaissance we had these whatever the word is, these all-encompassing geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci, who was an artist and a scientist at the same time. It's not, because it's really hard to say what comes first. The people at OpenAI who worked on GPT, in my opinion, are as much artists as they are engineers. Now, of course, the engineering work typically prevails. It's just the tedious solving of actual mathematical problems, implementation, coding. But there's an artistic process here that one shouldn't underestimate. But still, let's say the one difference between the self-driving car team at Tesla and an artist, let's say there's a person, I forgot the name, who was at GTC, an artist who was presenting generative AI art, and he did exactly that. He showed that it is the way the models are created and the data is fed. So then the process of the art itself, which is the thing that you actually see in the gallery, in this case was just you prompt something and then something happens, right? That's the process of the art. Just as a tangent here, by the way, this is not totally new. Joseph Beuys did similar things in his installations. This is a famous installation he did. I saw it at the Zurich Kunsthaus, where he put stuff in a room and he put like fatty, buttery materials in onto the sculptures, and then you would touch. You were invited actually to touch those things, and then your hands would be sort of fatty, and then you would, most of us maybe would kind of clean their hands on the wall, right? You would just try to shake off that fatty, glitzy feeling that you have on your finger, and that depiction of the wall with all those stripes of fingers being cleaned against the wall, that was part of the art. So this art evolved with the spectator and the object. So there's some of that concept. Generative art is already in Joseph Beuys's ideas. This, we're talking 1950, 60, I think, something like that. So again, certainly not totally new, but I would say that we have a much stronger perception now of what the art world will look like because we have the technology at our disposal. Just another tangent. What is the movie going to look like? The movie of 2050. The movie of 2050 will be potentially not even shot. What's gonna be shot is maybe some sort of prompt. Like, you're still gonna have to pay a lot of money for actors, good-looking people with nice voices. All of these things will still matter. Because what you're gonna do, you're gonna have to feed the AI something, and then the AI will generate the movie henceforward. And that's gonna be the process. So you might actually, as a director, you will shoot the prompting scenes, and then you will spend more of your time fine-tuning the model, maybe, GPT-50 at that point or whatever, that is specific, or GPT film, or a model that has been pre-trained on millions and millions and millions of movies with the latest in mass autoencoder, autoregressive models, all that stuff, and then you will have a very, very sophisticated sort of diffusion 10.0, the many iterations from today. So that thing will be able to generate a particular movie given your prompt, but it's going to do it in a creative way, because that's going to be the process of the artistic endeavor. The actual fine-tuning of the model itself, the weights of that model will be that's the art. Now it will be expressed in, let's say, consumable ways such as movies, paintings, videos, but the art will be the weights or the parameters that have been trained, and the artist will be, at least for now, the human that does that. Of course, you could think, well, that could be a machine at some point that does that too, but let's not go there. That's not so important, because we could have a machine that trains the machine, but somebody has to train that machine that trains the machine. So we're still sort of in that world where the human plays a role, and we could think, at least theoretically, the human will always keep having a role. Maybe not as prominent, but it's certainly possible that the human will still play a role. But at least for now, look, this is going to change again. The same way modernity yielded to postmodernity, and now we're here. By the way, what's postmodernity? That's another interesting question, right? So we have the modern art movement, which is, we have you see art through the lens of theory, and what is postmodern art, which is you see art through the lens of something else. You don't accept theory anymore, because theory is top-down, elitist, and we have different ways to express that thing that we call theory. For example, random, or for example, it could be even like today, let's say the political movement in the US, which is diversity, DEI. So it could be, you just force a certain way of thinking onto people, and that's how they consume art. In my opinion, not the right way to go. But postmodernism is, it has this flair of anything goes, and there's no authority and there's no theory really, but we need some theory, whether it's Descartes or Foucault, and the art that came from there, postmodern art. I guess you could call Beuys maybe a postmodern artist in that way, because he's the first, to my knowledge, there's been others, but the first who is actually using generative art. So here we are saying the artist himself is not even is not delivering a finished project, and the theory, or whatever we see this through, the lens that we see this through, is going to be defined by the people who are interacting with the art. So you could say that's kind of postmodernism, right? And now we're making the next step. We're going from that interacting with the art towards interacting with the data set that is being fed to the machine, and then the machine will deliver something that we might call that the art. So the movie in my example, or a painting that was generated by an AI, but the actual art is not going to be the painting. The painting is just going to be the illustration of the weights that the AI has, which were trained by the artist. So the artistic endeavor is going to be the training of the machine, the training. So it's the data pipeline. Let's not forget the data pipeline. What kind of data are you expressing the machine with? So what do you feed the machine? what kind of model do you use. To some extent, it could even be the actual engineering of the compute infrastructure, to the extent that it impacts the generative aspects of the AI. So we could have a scenario where maybe the amount of high bandwidth memory will be part of the generative process. So the algorithms will smartly be allocating more memory or less memory depending on the availability of the hardware, and therefore also change the art. So you could even have the hardware itself being part of the artistic process. But I guess to summarize, what I'm trying to say is that the art world of the first half of the 21st century is going to be dominated by generative AI, which reflects the zeitgeist of a time where we are excited, convinced, maybe a little scared about the fact that we have found a way to do deep, unsupervised learning so we can identify patterns in raw data in many, 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 many dimensions, a lot more than humans can ever grasp. That will be used, that technology will be used to pre-train models, and then the artistic process will be the fine-tuning of those models, and the representation of the art itself. The representation of the art will be the illustration. So the art, the movie or the painting will be the illustration, while the actual art will be the weights, the parameters that were trained. And by the way, the same applies to science. I'm gonna, like I say, I'm writing a longer essay about this. It is really trying to define the age. I call it the age of hyperconjecture. So the end of theory and the area at the beginning of the area of hyperconjecture. I'm inviting people to change, that nomenclature, but we have to prepare ourselves for that. I think it's interesting. I think it's also, in the end, this is the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So why am I talking about all this? I think it's worth knowing where the puck is going, and this is definitely where the puck is going. So it will help you identify opportunities in the investment world. It will help you identify opportunities in the art world. You might as well make some money with art here. The art of the future is where the artist develops the model and trains the machine to then express the artistic process, the training of the machine. Whatever the machine generates is going to be the illustration of the art. Thank you.